Yeah, I think the first thing is you need to understand good posturing. I mean, if people are in that really ribs up, extended posture, they just can't get air in and out as quickly as they need to because the length tension relationships of all those muscles and the lack of space for that diaphragm to work are just aberrant. So I think a big part of it is reestablishing that positioning. You may use particular drills during the warm up to kind of almost give them that reset and create some stability in that range of motion to hold them. And I think that's why you see people get stitches in their sides. That's a little bit of a compensation for not being in a good position
Right.
and being, somewhat deconditioned potentially.
Sure, sure. So let's dig into movement. I have the feeling we can have a really good conversation right now, Eric,
Yeah,
about movement. Obviously, you're a smart guy. You guys do your own brand of functional training. We'll
yeah,
we'll loosely call it.
yeah.
What do you guys think is the biggest problem that we see in the fitness industry related to movement? Because there's so many idiots out there
Yeah.
teaching people how to train. What do you
Mhm.
think is the biggest like misconception or problem that people are trying to tell people to do?
I think there are a lot. I think one that I deal with on a really regular basis is that asymmetry is normal. It really there's an amount of asymmetry that's excessive and isn't necessarily appropriate. But we do go out of our way, especially with our baseball guys, to let them know, listen, asymmetry is normal. It's part of what makes you successful in your sport. So don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I
Right.
think probably more significantly though is kind of falling back to the thing we talked about earlier is laying fitness on top of dysfunction. I remember a great conversation with Gray Cook a couple years ago when he
Yeah,
was
Gray was
talking
my
about
guy.
what we use to classify fitness. We talk about cardiorespiratory fitness. We talk about muscular strength, flexibility. No one ever talks about a movement kind of classification of fitness. And that's one of the reasons I think the functional movement screen evolved, and it became something that was quantifiable that we could put a number on, to basically say, hey, you're not as fit as you thought. Yeah, you've got you're super lean, and you can bench press a lot of weight, but you hurt all over. So why? So I think that's a big part of it too.
Yeah, and so when you guys bring people in, what is your eventual goal with them? Is it just to get them moving as functionally? So once you restore, let's say, natural range of motion
Yeah.
and posture, how far do you guys try to take it?
I think you take it as far as people want to go.
Sure.
With our professional athletes, at the highest level, changing something by 1% could be the difference between not making it to the big leagues and, making a career out of it. So, and
Sure.
that's the difference between being in pain or not being in pain. So that's significant. But by that same token, I mean, we both know you've coached boot camps before. We've both had training clients that, a lot of guys just want to be able to crush some beers on Sunday during the football game, have a few slices of pizza and not feel bad about it. So, I think the demands are probably different depending on the population and what people have in mind. I think, notoriously that my biggest following has been probably a lot of the people who maybe are in the general fitness community but take things a lot more seriously. They're not just, it's not okay to just go and work out. They want to go and they want to train. So I think that's a little bit of a different dynamic. But I think it really does depend on the population.
It's so tough because we have these websites and there's all these fitness
Yeah.
gurus out there and stuff, and everybody's got their own brand and their own ideas and everything like that. I mean, so how do people know who's really a knowledgeable person and who's just this pseudo armchair theoretician? Like, what's your red flags that set you off and go like, he's a
Yeah.
bullshitter? You know what I mean?
You know, I, I always get concerned when I hear about guys that don't actually train people, and there's a reason for that. We live or we work in the most dynamic field in the world of health and human performance. If you think about what strength and conditioning really is, there was no research on strength and conditioning until the 1990s. Before that, it was Kenneth Cooper and the Aerobic Institute, and we had all this stuff in the 70s and 80s and the 90s and the 2000s rolled around. There's this giant kind of explosion of research that's looking at not just how we can improve performance, but how can we change chronic disease states by implementing resistance training, and what's the synergy between creatine and resistance training or whatever supplement may be. How do aerobic exercise and resistance training work together? So this is a ridiculously dynamic field. It changes every single day.
Right.
And I mean, look at exercise physiology. We were always taught that lactic acid was the cause of muscular fatigue. And I mean, I was in undergrad from 99 to 2003, and that's what they told me. And sure enough, they rewrote all the textbooks after I graduated college, and they found that lactate was actually a substrate for high intensity exercise. We need it in order to basically perform at high levels. So we're learning a lot about how the body works still and how the body responds to training. So I feel like it's very, very important to stay in the mix. And I think that's what you see from some of the most well-read, most educated, most helpful people in the business. They're still actively in the trenches and not just writing books, not just selling DVDs. They're actually interacting with people on a daily basis. And I think that's very, very key because you learn to understand the kind of the human psyche a little bit. You understand that it's not just about what's on a piece of paper; it's about how that's carried out. So that to me is very important. I live a 90-second walk across the street from my facility, so I've got a 15,000 square foot home gym essentially, and I get to see 150 to 200 people a day to test my theories out. So I'm very fortunate.
That's fantastic. You got 90 seconds from your gym.
Yeah,
See,
and I'm terrible. I drive half the time. That's the worst.
See, I would probably still be training more people if I was like that. I just moved into a
Yeah,
new home, and I have like about an 800 square foot garage gym
yeah,
here that I work in. But I just quit training clients and doing the boot camp things,
yeah.
you got me thinking about how I can get more connected.
You're gonna
Still,
miss it. That's the problem.
I kind of do already because
Yeah,
there is that it's a laboratory. You get to test out your theories and ideas on real people, and
exactly.
oftentimes you get a housewife here and then an old guy there and then a young guy there, and it's just so
Mhm.
different with each and
And
every
you
person.
never leave it at work. I mean, I've got a rowing machine in my basement just when I need peace and quiet to do it. I've got three professional baseball players staying at the house with me this week. Just like it kind of consumes you at some point. But I think it's all a means to an end of just trying to continuously get better at what you're doing.
Okay, well, let's leave some people with some useful stuff here, Eric.
Yeah,
So so if somebody were to come into you, let's say we started working on their posture and you assess
yeah.
them and so on and so forth. Let's take it to the basics. What are the basic barbell bodyweight exercises you like to have people do, and maybe some progressions for each one of those?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing everybody wants to do is squat, and not a lot of people squat well.
Sure.
And in fact, people who even may have good squat patterns, they may be kind of cheated through, big heel lifts, or people who have a lot of laxity, even though they're hanging out in the bad places. So, if you're looking at progressions, I think, looking at like something like a goblet squat and a TRX overhead squat, then maybe progressing to doing like a front squat before you get to a back squat eventually. And there are people who may never squat. Maybe they've got a bony block in their hip, or they've got a history of back pain, and they're better off doing a reverse lunge with a front squat grip or something like that, where they
Sure.
can get that same axial loading with a weight on their shoulders without doing it in bilateral stance. So, you look at a deadlift, I always like to teach you the trap bar first. If we need to regress that, it might be like a kettlebell sumo deadlift, where we teach people a better hip hinge pattern. From a trap bar, we might go to a sumo deadlift and then eventually to a rack pull or conventional deadlift, something along those lines. So I think progression wise, those are all good. And, we talk a lot about having a good balance of pressing exercises. Don't just bench all the time. Make sure you've got push-up stuff, some overhead work, people can handle it, landmine presses, things along those lines as well.
Sure, sure. And rows, I'm assuming as
Yeah.
well.
Oh, hugely important.
Yeah,
And
rows and pulls
guys,
and pull-ups and everything.
yeah, people mess those up all the time too. It's important to really spend some time making sure that the movement of the scapula on the rib cage is correct.
So even if somebody comes to you with, say, like a goal of fat loss, are you going to give them kind of the same paradigm of, foundational movement, stability, mobility, and then building strength? Is that kind of like
Yeah.
the approach you take with most people?
Yeah, I mean they're not mutually exclusive. You can move better while dropping body fat, gaining muscle mass, doing whatever you need to do. I think we do a lot of our corrective works during our warm ups,
Sure.
with our foam rolling and our mobility exercise and some activation stuff. And and I think the biggest thing is don't let people train through poor technique. You can give them challenging exercises, and potentially with shorter rest intervals, things like that. If body composition changes are very important to them, you can certainly give them those as long as you're coaching it, you're giving them the cues they need to be successful. And then, I think where people get into trouble is they make those metabolic conditioning options too complex. So like everybody kind of gives CrossFit a hard time for this, and I think the reason is when you hear about people doing sets of 20 Olympic lifts, like your technique, no matter how good you're going to
Let's
be,
break it
is
down.
is not going to look good with a clean and a snatch on rep number 20. But how many people push the sled with bad technique? Like
Yeah.
your technique doesn't break down. You just get exhausted and the sled stops moving. So it's a very self-limiting exercise. And I think that's what you try to do with folks when you're making corrective changes is you give them things that in which they can't fail.
Right. That's a good approach. So you mentioned sleds versus, higher up Oli lifting. What are some of your other favorite conditioning exercises that you guys use with your athletes and clients?